Hassan.
Okay.
My name is Samera Hassan, and I am, I'm from MEMOS, which stands for Medieval and Early Modern Orient. And what we are is an AHRC funded project which seeks to further knowledge and understanding of early interactions between England and the Islamic world. So basically our main kind of focus is on this website that we have that I just wanted to show you. As part of this website, as you can see, we've got different sections which focus on different empires of the early modern periods. And within those sections, we have an overview of the history of that time, of Anglo-European Islamic encounters of that time. We have a timeline of important events, and we also have a bibliography for each of these sections as well. So basically, we're a sort of collection of academics, and we're, as well as exploring these engagements, we also want to be a point of engagement. So we really try to make this a space where different researchers and practitioners from different backgrounds who are all dealing in this sort of area can connect to each other, and then we can stay up to date with news and events in the field. In terms of who our team is made up of, I'll just get the team page up. So this is our team with our lovely faces on it. We're quite a diverse team, which we've tried to do. We try to have a diversity in terms of there being people of color, women of color. The entire admin team are all women of color. Also, we try to have academics from institutions, both Western institutions and non-Western institutions. So we have academics from all over the world that are part of our team. So I'm just going to show you as well some of the other pages that we have. So like I said, we try and post up news, which are, news items that are anything to do with the types of history that we deal with. And we really hope that's useful for people in terms of their career furtherance and stuff. As you can see, we've got a lot of job opportunities up here. And we've got an events page, which has different conferences and similar type of events that hopefully people would find interesting. And also we have our blog page, which showcases research to do with these Anglo-Islamic encounters from both our team and from guest bloggers as well. I run the blog, so this is my favorite page. And and if anyone is interested in submitting a blog to our blog page, you're more than welcome to, because I love to have new blogs on. Hang on, I've got the wrong thing up now. So what I wanted to say in terms of memos is that, as you can see at the moment, we have our 3 pages, which is our Ottoman page, our Safavid page, and our Mughal page, but we are expanding to concentrate on European Islamic encounters in North Africa and also in the Spice Islands in the Far East. So do keep your eyes peeled for these developments that are going to happen in our project shortly. And in terms of future projects that we have lined up, last year, was it last? No, but still this year. No. Earlier this year, we did a collaboration with a blog collaboration with the Folger Library, the Folger Shakespeare Library, whereby people from our team wrote blogs that were showcased on both the Folger Shakespeare Library webpage and on our own webpage. We're going to do something similar again next year with the British Library, so that's quite exciting. We've also got a couple of other things in the pipeline. I'm not entirely sure how much I'm allowed to divulge, like we might have a podcast series coming up next year, hopefully. So, which would be sort of a series of interviews with established academics in this field. And yeah, I just wanted to also say just a few notes on how memos came about. So it came about, well, yeah, several years ago, I met Lubaba Al-Azami, who's our editor. We were both at King's College London. I was doing my master's there. She was doing her undergrad. And we were both perplexed by the fact that Anglo-Islamic encounters it was such an important part of early modern literature, early modern history, but it seemed to be quite unknown to most people. It wasn't really a sort of mainstream thing that you would be studying in an undergraduate course, for example, and certainly not at all in like a secondary school English. Like it would not be something that would be referred to, and we would think that we'd like to redress that somehow. Yeah, so we would talk about it on and off for several years. But yeah, last year we actually launched with our wonderful team, including Charlie and Hannah, among others. And yeah, and since then it's been going really well. Yeah, and I think that's everything I want to say about memos.
I want to welcome you all to the final or penultimate session of this really rich smorgasbord, if you wish, of panels and papers in these 2 days. And we are very grateful for the organizers, Tessa, Laurence, and Anne, for putting this really impressive event together. And I want to, next, I want to introduce our two speakers in a more academic way than in a more matey way that we've come to know each other through memos. Our first speaker is Charlie Beirouti, and Charlie has recently submitted his PhD thesis in history at the University of Oxford. Very well done, Charlie, and is now awaiting his viva. Funded jointly by New College and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, his PhD centered broadly on the depiction of religious cultures and of Islam and Eastern Christianity, especially in 17th century English travel accounts, particularly those written by Church of England clerics who lived, worked, and traveled within the Mughal and Ottoman empires. Charlie is also a copy editor for the Memos website and a regular contributor of blog posts. He's currently helping to produce a special issue of Memos articles for the Society for Renaissance Studies journal, Renaissance Studies, in which his own work will feature. And his talk today is entitled "The Most Superstitious, Credulous, Fabulous Creatures Alive, John Covell, 1638 to 1722, and Popular Religion in the Ottoman Empire." Over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you all for coming. À nos amis français, merci d'être venus. C'est un vrai plaisir d'être là. As Hannah said, today I'm going to be talking to you about John Covell, a 17th century Anglican traveller who served as a chaplain to the English embassy in Istanbul, the English embassy to the Ottoman port, to the Ottoman Empire in the 1670s. And during this time, he traveled across large parts of Greece and Asia Minor in particular, and he also visited North Africa on his way to Istanbul and other parts of Europe. So hopefully at least some of you have had a chance to read the short paper that I sent to the organizers. What I'm going to try and do over the next 10-15 minutes is put that paper into some kind of broader historiographical context. So I adapted that paper from my PhD thesis from one of my chapters. When I was adapting that paper, when I was writing that paper, I was fast approaching my PhD deadline. So it perhaps wasn't as polished as I would have liked, but hopefully we can fill in some of those gaps. And I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, because I think you have my paper, and I'd much rather talk about this with you all, and give you all plenty of space to ask lots of lovely questions. But essentially, as I say, this paper was taken from my PhD thesis, and this thesis centres on a small group of clerics within the Church of England, all of whom travelled throughout either Mughal India or the Ottoman Empire during the 17th century. It examines their understandings and perceptions of the myriad religious traditions that populated those states, most notably Eastern Christianity and Islam, largely because these two religions were typically the religions that were most visible to them, and perhaps we can discuss some of the reasons that was the case in our Q&A. But by studying their perceptions of first-hand perceptions of Eastern Christianity and Islam, for instance, my thesis explores the impact of travel to the Mughal and Ottoman empires and of first-hand exposure to their religious diversity specifically on how English travellers thought about religious theory, ceremony, and practice within the Church of England. In other words, it considers how experiences of travel within the East shaped English travellers' views of the right and wrong ways of worshipping God, and how they sought to apply this knowledge in their service of the English Church. And that's a very important point, because when these travellers, including Covell, were reflecting on their experiences of religion overseas, they weren't so interested in more abstract theological or doctrinal questions. They were actually interested in the everyday worship of different religions, different religious cultures, and they were more interested in what their experiences meant for some very fundamental, some very everyday, very practical questions within the Church of England. So, for instance, about how communion ought to be received, or about how the interiors of Anglican churches ought to be laid out. And so within this broader framework, my thesis makes several interlocking arguments. So firstly, that our travellers use their experiences overseas to reflect on the role of church-led education and learning in the cultivation and consolidation of right worship. Secondly, that there exists a uniquely English, as opposed to more broadly Western or European, experience of the Mughal and Ottoman empires in the early modern period. And that is, or that experience was unique insofar as it was shaped by uniquely domestic frames of reference regarding, say, the everyday worship of the Church of England. And finally, that our travellers, as a result of their experiences abroad, frequently thought and wrote about religious issues in ways that distinguish them from their non-travelling contemporaries, and that paved the way for new and even controversial intellectual and practical approaches to the established church. And so in making these arguments, I hope that I'm helping to open up new avenues for the study of early modern English travel on the one hand, and of the early modern Church of England on the other. So in that respect, my thesis aims to knit together several historiographies, though hopefully not in an artificial way, but in a way that better serves the history of travel, the history of the early modern Church of England, and our understanding of those experiences and institutions. And of course, my paper, or the paper that I sent, that I submitted, explores how John Covell, during his time in Istanbul and during his travels throughout Asia Minor, throughout the Ottoman Empire, used his first-hand experiences of religion and of Eastern Christianity and Islam specifically to reflect on the wrong ways of worshipping God. So much of my thesis is concerned with how Church of England travellers use their experiences of overseas religion to reflect on what it meant to worship God correctly and to identify the building blocks of a suitably reverent English church and society in which the right kinds of worship took place. But actually, one of the themes that unites these travellers is that they were all looking, they were equally interested in what it meant to worship God incorrectly, and they wrote about notions of superstition, idolatry, and priestcraft. So there are a couple of things I want to pick up on that I didn't really have enough space to go into during my or as part of my paper. So I suppose firstly that when these travelers wrote about religious error, they drew on their first-hand experience. So most of their colleagues, or at least most of their non-traveling contemporaries and colleagues, when they wrote about religious error, they might refer to the Islamic world or Eastern Christianity, but they were more likely to engage with the Catholic Church on the one hand, and paganism on the other, and accounts of early Christianity, and so on. So certainly Covell is distinct insofar as he's certainly thinking about paganism and Catholicism and how both pagans and Catholics are guilty of religious error and religious corruption, but he's also backing his observations up, or his observations in that regard up, with kind of allusions to his experiences of travel, his first-hand experiences of the Ottoman Empire. And there's certainly a sense that because he has this first-hand experience, he's a more kind of reliable commentator. And one of the points that I sought to make in my paper was that the notion of superstition was a common feature of Covell's work, partly because of the nature of the religious landscape that he encountered within Ottoman territories. So for instance, I've written about in my paper about the notion of agrarian religion as explored by James Graham, and certainly the veneration of saints and physical objects was particularly widespread among different sects, among different religions in the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman countryside during this period, and that was a part of what James Graham has called or has termed agrarian culture, agrarian religion, and it enabled him to explore this notion of superstition and how it worked in practice. And certainly one of Covell's arguments was that superstition was a result of ignorance, a lack of education. So if I can find, I've lifted some notes from my thesis, and certainly, let me try and find it now, apologies. So essentially, Covell encountered a dynamic whereby superstition emerged out of ignorance. And he found that this was particularly true within ceremonies where worshippers from different religions joined together in their adoration of or devotion to a particular saint. So when Covell was in Edernay in 1675, for instance, he witnessed a memorable example of this shared devotional culture surrounding, which in this case surrounded the Virgin Mary. And he attributed its local popularity to the ignorance and credulity of the Eastern Christians, Jews, and Muslims involved. So I'll just take you through this example, and then perhaps we can leave further discussion for the Q&A. So on the 15th of August, 1675, Covell attended local celebrations for the Assumption of the Virgin Mary in Edernay. And during the festivities, he saw a group of elderly women bring water from the river and mix it and some clay together into what he called a perfect pudding or stodge. And following this, he saw Turks, Muslims, local Muslims, Jews, and Christians essentially cover themselves in this clay, and according to local worshippers, this would cure them essentially of any illness or sickness, any disability. And Covell explained that Eastern Christians, Jews, and Muslims regarded the water as sacred because of its association with the Virgin Mary. But of course, Covell was entirely unconvinced by the idea that the water was sacred, calling it a, and I quote, notorious lie communicated by old hags. So for although Covell accepted that some of those who covered themselves in the mixture of clay and water were cured of their maladies, he explained that this was only because the earth was, and I quote, a kind of fuller's earth, or very abstersive, and may do good, and may do good in many cutaneous diseases without the help of the Virgin Mary, as they call her. But of course, Covell was reluctant to publicly dispute this miracle, for he feared that if he had done so, he would have been kind of publicly attacked or essentially called out. So in his recollection of this supposedly miraculous event in Edernay, Covell's making this implicit distinction between himself as a rational Anglican, capable of distinguishing between natural phenomena and divine agency, and Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews, on the other hand, all of whom appear largely ignorant and are therefore vulnerable to priestcraft and superstition, as they are in this case. So in so doing, Covell casts not only himself, but also his faith as more rational by contrast, at least by implication. And certainly this framing of Covell's framing of himself and his religion as more rational is consistent with a broader rhetoric within the later 17th century Church of England. For certainly during this period, Anglicans sought to demonstrate that theirs was a religion of reason, grounded on the critical evaluation and inductive scrutiny of evidence and testimony, including that provided by the Bible or Scripture, the Church Fathers, and the natural world, using tools appropriate to natural philosophy and history. And certainly such a rational approach was thought to distinguish Anglicanism from the blind faith and clerical obscurantism of other creeds, most notably Catholicism and Puritanism, the Church of England's two main theological enemies. So Covell's using his experiences of travel to reflect on the dynamics of superstition and to distinguish himself and his church from that category of analysis. And certainly he's building on an existing Anglican framework, but he's fleshing it out with his experiences of travel, as if to say, you know, I mean, he's using his experiences of travel to intervene in contemporary disputes, actually, and to flesh them out and to add kind of a new dimension. I'm aware that I've been speaking for over 10 minutes now, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to leave it there, and then we can have a back and forth over the next, after Samira has spoken. But thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Let's move on to our second panelist, Samira Hassan. Samira is one of the founding sisters of Memos. She's a deputy editor of it, and she completed her BA in English from the University of Sussex and MA in Early Modern English Literature, Text and Transmission from King's College London. She began a PhD at the University of Sussex, researching the changing perceptions of Islam in English writing between the first two printed English translations of the Quran in 1649 and 1734. Her interests include Arabic texts translated into English in the early modern period and discussions of Islam in early modern religious polemic. And her paper, which was pre-circulated as well, is entitled Muslim Mysticism in Early Modern England, Anglican and Quaker Responses to Hayy ibn Yaqtan. I'm sure I sort of slaughtered that name. I'm sorry about that. Over to you, Samira.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks, Charlie. I've got lots of questions for you, actually, Charlie, after my own talk. Yeah, and thanks to the organisers of the conference for allowing us to present these papers. So as Hannah said, my paper is on Anglican and Quaker responses to a text called Hayy ibn Yaqtan, which was incredibly influential throughout the early modern period in England and in Europe. And I specifically I was reading the text earlier this year for something else completely different, and then it just it struck me that out of the four, it was translated 4 times within a 37-year period in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And 3 of those times it was translated by Anglican clergymen. So here's an interesting link with Charlie here, the sort of the Anglican link to this engagement with Islam. It's not something that I had actually really thought very much about before, because my research prior to this was a lot more involved in sort of radical sort of fringe engagement with Islam via various groups such as the Socinians, Anti-Trinitarians, Quakers. But it was, I thought it would be quite interesting to look at specifically Anglican approach to this Islamic text, and why it was that they felt that this text was of importance, and to the extent that it was translated the number of times that it was. But yeah, anyway, I'll give you a little introduction to the text. So it was written in the 12th century by the Andalusian Muslim philosopher and physician Ibn Tufayl. It's based on an earlier text written by Ibn Sina, the famous philosopher. It had already been translated into Hebrew in the 14th century by Moses of Narbonne, and it had been translated into a paraphrase Latin in Italy in the late 15th century. But the text was printed in England for the first time in 1671. It was translated from Arabic into Latin. Officially, it was translated by the Anglican clergyman Edward Pocock Jr., although it's widely believed that it was actually translated by his father, Edward Pocock Sr., who was the chair of Arabic at Oxford and was the leading Arabic scholar in the country at the time. There's been some research done on Edward Pocock the Jr.'s Arabic skills, and it's generally a consensus that he did not have the requisite Arabic skills in order to translate this text into Latin. So it's generally assumed that it was his father that was the person actually doing the translating. And as I mentioned, it was translated over the following 37 years, a further 3 times in England. So in 1674, you have Pocock's Latin translated into English by the Quaker George Keith. In 1686, you have Pocock's Latin again translated into English again, but by an Anglican clergyman called George Ashwell. And then in 1708, you have it translated from Arabic directly into English by the Anglican clergyman Simon Ockley. And I was just going to give a very brief synopsis of the text, what it's about. So it's called Hayy ibn Yaqtha, and it's about a baby that's it's either abandoned or it self-generates on an island without any other humans, and it's raised by a deer. And basically this baby grows up to observe the world around him, and he comes to conclusions about the natural world. He conducts experiments, he makes observations, he develops a system of categorization of the natural phenomena around him on the island. But soon he feels that this is not enough to concentrate on this physical phenomena. And as he matures, his quest for knowledge becomes more esoteric, and he begins to apply his intellect to the quest for knowledge of the creator. And then he develops certain spiritual practices by himself on this island. And these spiritual practices involve meditation, prayer, fasting, rotating in circles on the spot, but also walking around the island in circles, and cutting himself from the outside world by shutting himself off in a cave. And the story climaxes in an extended description of vision of heaven and hell that Hayy encounters, and of an ecstatic union with God. And eventually on the island, there turns up another human being called Asl, who's come to basically to be a hermit and to devote his life to spiritual contemplation, but to his surprise, he finds this human on the island, and he teaches Hai how to speak, and he discovers that Hai has this spiritual knowledge that supersedes anything that Asal has ever encountered, despite the fact that he's never received any religious instruction or any exposure to any revealed religion. So Asal takes Hai back to his home island in an attempt to try and impart Hai's religious knowledge to the people, but they find the people are largely hostile to Hai's spiritual advice and his advocacy of worldly renunciation. So Hai decides that revealed religion, it doesn't say explicitly what the revealed religion on this island is, but it's generally accepted to be Islam, is the best religion for the normal person who can't attain these mystical heights that he has. And the story ends with him and Asal going back to the island, the two of them by themselves, to enjoy this mystical union with God until their deaths. So yeah, what I wanted to ask is why, sorry, one second, I've opened up the wrong notes on my thing. Here we go. Yeah, so what I wanted to ask was what it was that prompted these Anglican translators to translate this text, because it's a doubly unusual choice, I thought, because it's both very much in the Islamic tradition. It's got Quranic excerpts throughout the text, and also it's to do with mystical practice. It's perhaps not so surprising that the text would appeal to our Quaker in the four translators, George Keefe, because it has that, it's about, you know, having a direct intuitive experience of God over mediation of revelation. But Hai and Ibn Tufayl in Hai ibn Yaqzan, he explains in his foreword that it's specifically written to provide an introduction to mysticism to those who are interested. And I thought it was a very unusual choice for post-Civil War Anglicans who are attempting to tread this middle path between Catholicism on one hand and Puritanism and Quakerism on the other. And because there is this very strong tendency to try and disavow mystical enthusiasm that they encountered on either side of this divide. And I use the word enthusiasm here. Well, it's used by all of the Anglican writers to refer to mystical practices that are associated by groups such as the Quakers. And also the fact that the text was designed to provide practical religious instruction. It was not supposed to be a text that would you'd just read for academic purposes. Ibn Tufayl says in the foreword, this is an introduction to mysticism for anyone who wants to get involved in it. And so I thought, what was it about the mystical Islamic experience as depicted in Hai that Anglican translators felt was deserving of an audience? And yeah, this, it struck me that most scholarship on Islam in theological discussions in the early modern period, it really does focus on sort of marginal dissenting groups. So I said, for example, you have discussions about the Trinity, about the divinity of Christ, about the status of the Prophet Muhammad, and these are all sort of recurring themes in texts that are discussed in groups such as Socinians, Unitarians, Quakers, etc. And yeah, and I just wanted to compare that to this text, which seems to be really engaged with by those who are very much in the heart of the established Church of England. Yeah, and I thought that this was quite an interesting link with the aims of memos, sort of repositioning of discussions of Islam in early modern English history, and specifically here in the early modern English religious experience. That Islam is like vehemently tussled over and used in polemic by dissenting groups is important, but it's also being discussed in very much mainstream English like Anglican discourse, and it seems to be engaged with very much in the English religious life of the mainstream. And this is exemplified in this translation activity surrounding Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. And so I thought it's quite interesting that, yeah, it's sort of, it kind of turns on its head this idea that the only discussion is happening on the margins of this religious discourse and not actually within the sort of mainstream English religious experience. So yeah, in my paper, I discussed those three Anglicans and one Quaker and how they approached the text and their reasons for doing so, for translating the text in their forewords. I don't want to go into too much detail about it because the paper is out there. But I just wanted to say sort of two conclusions that I came to by reading those different forewords by those different Anglicans and Quaker. The first one was that there seems to be no consensus among Anglicans on how to approach mysticism and mystical practice. So you have the prefaces written to Hayy by the three Anglicans. They range from George Ashwell, who's just enthusiastically endorsing Hayy ibn Yaqdhan's methods for attaining mystical union with God, which I find, yeah, he loves the book, and he really does not believe it to be a cerebral academic exercise, but it's of vital importance to the average Anglican reader in England to read this book and to take on board the mystical practices that are employed in it in one's own life. He uses Hayy ibn Yaqdhan as a really interesting tool for establishing a middle path between God heedlessness on one side and sort of overzealousness on the other side. And it's really interesting that Hayy ibn Yaqdhan is the text that that exemplifies that middle path for him as an Anglican. And I don't even know how long I've been talking for. I'll try and wrap up because I think I've been talking for quite a long time. And you compare that with Edward Pocock, he has a very opaque sort of academic neutrality in terms of what he thinks of the text. So even in the way that his text is laid out, you have the Arabic text on one side of the page and the corresponding Latin text on the other. It's very much an academic text that it's for an academic use that he wants this text to be read for. In his foreword, he doesn't disavow mysticism or mystical, that he doesn't disavow that it's possible to have a mystical union with God, but he does point out the dangers of doing so because a mystical experience can lead people down a route to various heresies. So he's not as enthusiastic as George Ashwell, but he does see the validity of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan's mystical experience. And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, you have our third Anglican, Simon Ockley, who has a scathing critique on the possibility that anyone at all, be they Christian, Muslim, or pagan, could enjoy such a union of God. His reasoning is that the prophets themselves were not able to have such a union with God, so there's no way that an ordinary layman could. This leads on to my second point, which was that the discussion of mysticism by these writers led to a really interesting equivalence being drawn between Orthodox Islam and small o Orthodox Christianity, Anglican Christianity. There's a statement by Simon Ockley which kind of really highlights what I'm talking about. And it's, as true piety is the same in all ages and climates, and good solid sense too, so also is enthusiasm. So what he's saying here is that Orthodox Islam, as well as Christianity, is true piety. And like Christianity, Orthodox Islam can also suffer from the impieties of purveyors of enthusiasm from among their ranks. So it's a complete redrawing of this traditional dichotomy of having Islam versus Christianity, and instead you have piety versus impiety, but within that group of piety you have pious Muslims and Christians, and then on the other side you have impious Muslims and impious Christians, i.e. enthusiasts. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting because it's a really much more fluid and accommodating view of Islam and Islam's validity as a path to God or a religion than you would normally expect from an Anglican clergyman at the time, such as Ockley. And yeah, those are the main points that I wanted to make. I'm going to stop talking now because I'm really pregnant and it's quite exhausting. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to questions now, but thank you for your time and for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Samira, and very well done. We all appreciate that the fact that you actually made it to this conference. We were fearing a bit, but you're still here, and the baby will arrive soon.
Feels like it.
Thank you for really engaging and interesting papers. Obviously, for me, especially, these topics are really, really exciting. Do feel free to raise your hands or ask questions in the chat. Whilst you're still forming your thoughts, I might start off with a little bit of sort of a wider question for both panelists in terms of the themes of this conference and lived religion. I think it's especially interesting in both papers how mediation of Islam within an Anglican context changes according to various authors' positions and frameworks, and perhaps even sort of theological positions as well. And but in both of them, we can see a sort of didactic streak where lessons are imparted with the help of Islam and Islamic theology to Anglicans of either the church, academia, or wider publics. And in terms of lived religion, I mean, they are the so-called lived religion of Islam becomes a bit like a specter or foil in these discussions, obviously. And in terms of their epistemological status and layers surrounding them, like an onion, where do you see them in relation to, for example, like the women in Huittinen described in a court case, very sort of distant from that experience by the women. I don't know if you saw the papers, both of you, and then you know, the depictions of Jesuits of Japan and Chinese worship. Did they manage to grasp something? Obviously, there are many positive aspects that we can see also from their perceptions of Eastern religious life. But where do we stand in these? What's the status here of these sources? What can they tell us about? Can they tell us anything about the lived religion, or is it just a really distorting mirror that mediates and transmits Islam in mostly for, you know, the use of imparting lessons? Either of you can. Sorry about the long-winded question.
No,
but
Samira, did you want to chip in, or?
You know, you go ahead, Charlie.
I'll go ahead. You have just spoken. So it's a really good question. I mean, thankfully, we've moved on from a time when historians were studying experiences of lived religion within, say, the Ottoman Empire, using only European Western sources, using only travel accounts, and certainly I think these travel accounts reveal more about the societies, the cultures from which these travelers came, than they do about, you know, the places to which they traveled and the cultures which they encountered. I think that's a fairly, you know, I mean, that's a truism, and I think that's acknowledged by most historians. Having said that, most of these accounts, you know, they're not devoid of truth when it comes to how you know, how religion was practiced, how religious cultures were constructed within the Ottoman Empire, for instance. I think we can only see that if you know, if we use for instance, so we need to engage with regional historiographies. So for instance, we need to engage with Ottomanists and use some of the fantastic work that they've been producing, and essentially, match their accounts up with our own travel accounts. So in the case of Covell and one of his contemporaries who also travelled to the Ottoman Empire, Sir George Wheeler, another Anglican traveller. For instance, they're writing about shared religious cultures, so ceremonies and ceremonies in which worshippers from, say, Islam, Eastern Christianity, and Judaism all participated. They're writing, for instance, about a Marian cult of devotion among these different religions and religious cultures. And certainly we know from the excellent work of James Graham, for instance, that this was, very much a feature of the Ottoman religious landscape, particularly the rural religious landscape at this time. So in that respect, these accounts can shed light on those phenomena, but they just need to be used cautiously and in tandem with regional historiographies. And I think this point about regional historiographies is really important, because I think so much of what we do has been inspired, or rather impacted, by global history and this notion of border crossers, cross-cultural subjects, travelers, whatever you want to call them. But I think because of that, and we focus on these global processes, these global journeys, whatever you want to call them. But I think because of that, you sometimes remove these travelers from the contexts into which they inserted themselves, not only in England, that's one regional historiography, but also overseas, and that's another. And so on the Ottoman side, if we engage with, say, as I say, some of the work that Ottomanists have been doing, I think these travel accounts can be really useful in adding substance to what is already there. But as I say, they have to be used cautiously. I hope I have answered your question there, but I definitely think there's an important point to make here about the value of regional historiographies, and not, these globetrotters, as we might term them, they're fascinating, but they came from somewhere, and they lived somewhere and worked somewhere, and they lived in a context and worked within that context. And I think we have to be careful not to separate them. So perhaps there's a broader historiographical point to make here as well. Those are just some ideas that your question kind of threw up.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's really really interesting and really new also to find evidence of exchange and lived experience in those sources. They pop up and sometimes really subtly, leaving traces all around their accounts. But those can sometimes be really revealing of the transmission.
Yeah. And rooted in a very specific, context, often rooted in a very specific set of arguments. So much of my thesis is concerned with, how some of these, so for instance, one of my travelers, Covell, actually, John Covell, whom I spoke about today, he writes at one stage in his diaries that most religions outwardly are the same. So in terms of ceremony and in terms of kind of like outwardly they resemble each other in terms of kind of belief in the afterlife, and they all follow their saints and doctors and scholars and so on. And he makes this rather remarkable comment, this striking comment about how most religions are essentially alike, at least outwardly. And a lot of historians have picked up on this and used it as an example of cosmopolitanism, or an early English cosmopolitanism, like vis-a-vis the Muslim world. And certainly there's a truth in that. But actually, this comment, as I hope to demonstrate, or as I hope I've demonstrated in my thesis, is actually rooted in his entire, kind of religious philosophy, which makes a very kind of sharp distinction between inward forms of religion, like morality and the pursuit of a holy and virtuous life, and like outward behavior. So there's a really important context here that we can lose. I think partly because these subjects are they're pretty sexy. Like, these travelers, they do kind of, they do some of the experiences that they had, and some of the ideas with which they engaged, they kind of jump off the page. But I think we just have to be careful to place them in the proper context. I don't think what I'm saying is like revolutionary. I just think it's sometimes there's a tendency maybe sometimes to describe what they were doing rather than kind of analyze it.
I now have a very disturbing image of all the 17th century English chaplains to the Levant as sexy.
Yeah, I know, that was a really poor choice of, that slipped out.
Some of the let's say just some of the literary output is quite heavy going, if you don't mind me saying so. But I do agree that they are really rich texts. Samira, I was struck by the Pocock's openness to mysticism as an experience, and sort of in comparison, like someone like Locke and Hobbes you mentioned in your paper. And it struck me also that this story is a really sort of the story really encapsulates the wonder about nature and nurture, and how like a human being can be formed on an island. And it's sort of the obvious relevance and influence that comes to mind is, of course, Robinson Crusoe. And I think was it named as one of the influences behind that novel as well? Like,
yeah, it's there's been quite a lot of work published on the similarities between Hayy ibn Yaqdhan and Robinson Crusoe, and that it was an influence on Robinson Crusoe. And the influence of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, it reaches in all sorts of different directions. I mentioned a few books on it on my paper for further reading, because I could not possibly cover all of the influences it had in England and Europe at that time in my paper. So there's an obvious similarity, isn't there, between Robinson Crusoe and Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. I had a question for Charlie, actually. Can I? In terms of your Anglican travelers, obviously I'm quite interested in Edward Pocock, because he was the Arabist of his time, but as far as I know, he didn't really write much about his travels, if anything. Am I correct in that?
Yes, you are. He didn't write. I'm no Pocock specialist, but from what I've read by Simon Mills, actually, whom I see that Tessa has mentioned, and I'll pick up on that hopefully in my answer. But he wrote very little about his travels.
Yeah. And these other travelers that were traveling to the Ottoman and Mughal empires, did they engage in any translation work in the way that Edward Pocock did?
Some did, but actually in fact, all of the travelers whom I study, their language skills were limited. So I studied one traveller who was in India, Mughal India in the 1610s, Edward Terry, and he made some effort to learn Persian, but certainly never, I don't think he ever came anywhere near being fluent. Covell and Wheeler were more interested in ancient Greek, so both of them made an effort to learn modern Greek, partly because they wanted to communicate with Eastern Christians, and they were disappointed that most Eastern Christians or most Greek Christians specifically were unable to speak ancient Greek, and spoke of course, the vernacular, modern vernacular. This is actually where I could perhaps pick up on what Tessa has written in the comments about Simon Mills. Yeah, I'm aware of Simon's work. Simon's done some really excellent work on English clerics in the Ottoman Empire in this period. I'm a big fan, and his own work, has been a big kind of inspiration for me. I suppose where my travellers differ and where my work differs from Simon's, and in a way, I hope this will link into what you're saying, or what you're asking, Samira, is that so Simon is more interested in how clerics, or how a certain group of clerics essentially contributed to early modern English scholarship. So for instance, they collected like Greco-Roman antiquities, they learned local languages, Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, and so on. They helped to print and distribute some of the earliest Protestant literature in Arabic, and they pioneered the modern field or early modern field of Oriental studies. So many of them, for instance, were interested in learning Hebrew to unlock the secrets of the Old Testament and of the Bible, and learning Arabic for much the same reason, actually. Whereas my travelers are actually more interested in practical worship, if I can call it that. So they're interested in scholarship, but they're not as scholarly as some of these other clerics, and they're more interested in more mainstream religious and political issues. So in this case, like how might worshippers lapse into superstitious everyday practices? So essentially, there's another context here. You know, some clerics are more interested in scholarship, and you know, the history of Islam and biblical studies, Oriental studies. But then there's another group who actually are contributing to or helping to answer some very everyday questions within the Church of England, like how should the church be governed is a big one. Like what's the relationship between faith and works is another. And they're often doing, you know, they're often tackling these questions in a way that kind of speaks to kind of what like everyday worship. And I mean, all three of the clerics I study had their own congregations, and, you know, were involved in kind of the cut and thrust, or the kind of like everyday religion, essentially.
I think Charlie already answered Mette's question, at least partially, in the chat with that. She asked, how were the accounts of your travelers received in the Anglican Church? I guess this could be sort of expanded to both of you as like as a question of reception. For example, Covell's text. How did Covell's book gain an enthusiastic reception? How was it received? Did it make him, or, you know, in Samira's case, what were the developments? I mean, there were lots of mediations of Hayun, but it's always interesting to look at how texts come alive and how practices related to them take over, and how they sort of transform in the process, I guess. Do you want to pick that up?
So I pick that up.
Do you want to pick that up now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in terms of specifically Hayy ibn Yaqdhan's influence on these Anglicans, it's really, I've only just started recently thinking about specifically Islam in discussions among Anglicans. So unlike Charlie, who's been thinking about it for years, it's something I've recently engaged with. So it's something I really want to look into. What is there any evidence of this text being used as a sort of a template for a certain type of religious experience among your sort of ordinary Anglican laymen in England? I don't know, and it's something that I really want to research further, actually. And yeah, as you said, obviously Hayy ibn Yaqdhan has a really big influence among various thinkers, like as I mentioned in my text, say Locke and Hobbes, and also in for example, I wrote a little blog post for Memos about Hayy ibn Yaqdhan being engaged with the Royal Society of Natural Philosophers. They were absolutely fascinated, especially by the first half of the text, which deals with Hayy ibn Yaqdhan's attempts to glean knowledge of God via experimentation and observation of the natural world, and of sort of reading the book of nature as it's referred to, in order to gain the greater knowledge of God. And they thought that this was a real vindication of their process, which was to sort of to start from ground zero in terms of assumptions about anything to do with a religion, and then to be able to gain those insights into God and the world that he created through observation and experimentation. So I guess that's one example of how Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, it was sort of put to practical use, and and yeah, it was used sort of to advocate the Royal Society's mission, as it were.
Thank you. I see there's a question from Raisa Toivo. Would you, Raisa, want to formulate it yourself, or ask it yourself, or shall I read it? Or?
Well, thank you. Maybe I can clarify myself a bit, because I maybe wasn't very bright when I wrote that. I'm thinking you talked quite a lot about the ways that these texts are part of genres and cultural and regionally shared concepts and discourses and historiographies and so on. And it has also been the sort of topic of the whole conference to sort of show how everything is communal and collective, and we're digging up that part of it. But the other side, of course, is the individual and the personal. So is there something, if you were asked to look at the personal side of it, is there something that you could say about their religious experiences that would be personal in these translations or the travel stories? What would the personal and individual part be?
Thank you, Raisa. Samira or Charlie, would you like to?
I can pick up on that. That's a really good question. I mean, certainly the individual or the lives and religious beliefs of individual travelers are very important to my work, you know, in terms of putting these things into context. Yes, on the one hand, there's a local context, so an Anglican context on the one hand and an Ottoman context on the other in the case of Covell, but also there's that individual context. And I didn't have time to fit this into my paper or into my talk, but for Covell, Covell was deeply influenced by the notion of what he called inward affection, and the distinction between outward forms of religious belief or religious practice and inward affection. So outward forms, for instance, are you know, many of the ceremonies that we follow or that they followed. It involved prostration before God, so sujud in the case of Islam, or you know, often Eastern Christians or Greek Christians would prostrate themselves before prayer or before entering their churches. So you have outward kind of markers of religion on the one hand, but then you also have what he terms inward affection, and this is difficult to define but easy to spot. So he defines it as the unfeigned exercise of a holy life, essentially. So one marked by the cultivation of virtue, and these virtues included like sincerity in worship, kind of a sense of integrity. I mean, you know, it was quite abstract, but he would, but because it was quite an abstract concept, Covell would use his experiences of kind of religion overseas to illuminate this concept. And certainly when he's writing about superstition, like one of the practices that he really doesn't like is the veneration of, you know, as is the case for many English Protestants, is the veneration of saints and material objects, material culture, and so certainly for Covell, one of the problems with kind of such forms of superstition, so in the case of material objects, is that those material objects essentially, you know, they acquire an inherent value, like separate to God, almost separate to God, and so like the worshippers kind of trust in and love for God is secondary to what is essentially an inanimate object, and it you know, it demonstrates a kind of lack of conviction, a lack of sincerity, a lack of inward affection, essentially. So certainly these individual kind of beliefs are particularly important. Yeah, these kind of individual ways of seeing the world and conceiving of religion, and they're often fleshed out with reference to travel and to different kind of religious cultures.
Thank you. Would you like to, Samira, add something on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in terms of the translators that I thought of, they all obviously had a very distinct individual response to the text, and I think only one of them, George Ashwell, was one that actually, and George Keith as well, that saw that they wanted to, and they thought it was a good idea to espouse the mystical practices as described in Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. But yeah, it's quite interesting to see the different individual responses to various things that Hayy ibn Yaqdhan does, as is described in the sort of side notes to the text. For example, as I mentioned in my paper, Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, one of the things that he does to gain a closeness to God is spinning around on the spot. And each of these translators has a very different reaction to that act. So for example, you have Pocock, who I think doesn't even comment on it. You have Ockley that says, oh, well, this is just some weird thing that Mohammedans do. But then the one who's most vehemently opposed to it is actually the Quaker George Keith. Every time it comes up, he puts a little apology next to the practice saying, oh, I'm really sorry, this is a Muslim thing. I'm not saying we should do this, we should not do this. Which I thought was quite interesting, because I suppose as a Quaker, he was much more on the defense in terms of how much he felt he could possibly, advocate this book compared to Anglicans who, because they were in the mainstream and sort of accepted as the mainstream, did not have to defend themselves so much against the more, I suppose, what they would feel as the more out there aspects of the practices that Hayy ibn Yaqdhan performed. But yeah, so in terms of the individual practice, they all did have their very different approaches to the various things that were done in the text.
I especially loved how Ashwell commented on the sort of didactic, his didactic philosophy in his translation, that, in order to make the masses understand these texts without any toilsome labor or perplexing of his brains in search of the truth. I mean, this really resonates to, tired academics at this time of year and perhaps later on. I think we have space for a couple of more questions. I can see Anna Hellier has had her hand raised for quite some time. Would you like to ask your question, Anna?
Hello. Well, it's actually quite a question coming from quite an ignorant position, because I know nothing, to Charlie in fact, I know nothing really about Anglican travellers. I think in the 17th and early 18th century you're talking about. I'm trying to understand the motivations for these travellers, because I know that, coming from my studies on Quakerism, there were Quaker travellers going off at the same time to the Ottoman Empire, and they were very much going on because they felt moved to go there on missionary expeditions. And I'm wondering what the motivations were for your travellers. Was there any missionary element, or was it purely observational, self-educational?
No, it's a great question. Certainly not an ignorant question at all. So most of the Anglican travellers whom I study, or Church of England travellers whom I study, served as chaplains to English embassies in the Mughal and Ottoman empires. So they ministered to local communities of mostly merchants and diplomats, small communities of, I suppose, expatriate Britons and others. So that was their raison d'etre first and foremost. That's why they had travelled to the Mughal and Ottoman empires, because they were interested in, I'm sure they were interested and interesting, but they were also employed by English trading companies to minister to their merchants and others. A smaller number of travellers travelled out of curiosity. So one of the travellers whom I study, Sir George Wheeler, came into a large inheritance, and he was intellectually curious. I have to say, most of them, they were curious about Islam, but also Eastern Christianity, because there was a sense that Greek Christians in particular because of their geography and history, had a link to the early church and might therefore be relied upon to like clarify contentious points of doctrine between Protestants and Catholics. So there was certainly a polemical reason there. Certainly there was no missionary impulse among any of the travellers whom I've studied. None of them engaged in any missionary activity, which was, you know, wasn't. I mean, without going into any detail, it wasn't. It was frowned upon within the Ottoman Empire at this time. So, you know, none of them were interested in missionary work, unlike the Quakers, with whom you're more familiar. Yeah, most of them were employed first and foremost, and then they were intellectually curious, but they also saw an opportunity to kind of reflect on their own church, the state of the Church of England, and on some of the questions that were animating Anglicans in the second half of the 17th century. But then there was also an interest in, you know, biblical history, kind of, and the Greek church, because, you know, as I say, there was a sense that Greek Christians had a link with the early church, but that they'd been corrupted by Catholics, and there was an opportunity here for kind of Anglicans to save them, essentially. Although there wasn't any missionary work per se. Yeah, I'll hand over to Samira there if you wanted to. Although I think that was a question for me.
That's a great clarification, and it's really interesting to hear your link back to like the kind of idea of the primitive church, maybe the early Christian church, and be interested in that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they would explore it in this way too. So with reference to you know, first-hand experiences of the Greek church, the present day Greek church. So I mean, I suppose it's one thing to study the early church using like scripture, the writings of the church fathers, I suppose, and early Christian theologians. That was, you know, very common in the 17th century Church of England. You know, patristics, or the study of the church fathers, was huge among Anglican theologians, and certainly all of the travellers, or most of the travellers whom I study, you know, were involved in that to one degree or another. They were all Oxford educated, or university educated, you know, and they wrote for an Anglican audience or Anglican theologians and intellectuals who were familiar with these frames of reference. But I suppose it's interesting that they're also saying, well, actually, we have first-hand experiences of the Greek church, and because they have adopted or inherited some of the legacy of that early church, you know, if we can separate out what is clearly Catholic corruption from what is more what has been inherited from the early church, you know, that there's an opportunity here, and that's, you know, that in that respect they do distinguish themselves from their non-traveling contemporaries. It was you know, it was quite unusual to refer to the Greek church in that way. I mean, there were debates over transubstantiation using the Greek church, but generally that's where it ended. So it's interesting that they're kind of thinking more broadly with reference or recourse to the Greek church.
Thank you. That is certainly interesting to compare Charlie's research to my own. We could sort of, both of us, cover like the long 17th century of these interactions with the Eastern Christian churches and the minorities, if you wish, of the Ottoman Empire. So I've just finished, inshallah, a book about early 17th century British encounters with the Eastern Christians and Jews of the Ottoman Empire. It's almost ready to go to press, or go to the copy editor. So it's very much been my companion these past couple of months, and it's really interesting to see continuities from Charlie's work and mine. I think we are just about to sort of have filled our time slot. What say you, and Tessa? If there are any last minute questions, now is the time to voice them, or forever hold your tongue. I think before we conclude, I really want to thank both our presenters and all the discussants and participants in this panel for really enjoyable discussion.
Thank you.